John Harper had always cherished the quiet mornings on his ranch, nestled just beyond the edge of a sprawling HOA community. The dawn light spilled softly across the dusty trails and golden fields, the kind of peaceful start that felt like a secret only he and the land shared. With a steaming cup of coffee in hand, he stepped onto his porch, savoring the cool breeze and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. But this morning was different. As his eyes swept across the horizon, John's calm began to shatter. Where the winding dirt road normally stretched open toward the main highway, massive steel walls now loomed. Shipping containers, cold, gray, and immovable, had been stacked haphazardly overnight, blocking every possible entrance and exit to his ranch. The sun glinted harshly off their sharp edges, turning what should have been a simple morning into a scene straight out of a war zone. John's heart quickened. The containers weren't just an inconvenience. They were a blockade, a fortress meant to trap him on his own land. No signs, no warnings, no notices, just steel sentinels standing guard against the world. He pulled out his phone to call the HOA office, but no one answered. Instead, a text arrived from an unknown number. "This is a warning. Comply or lose everything." John's jaw tightened. He knew the HOA had been tightening restrictions on property use lately, but this was an act of aggression. In the past, the HOA had enforced rules about lawn hikes or paint colors, but these containers, they screamed something else, something personal, calculated. They weren't just about control, they were about fear. John's mind raced. He wasn't just a rancher. For years, he'd worked as a federal land auditor, reviewing property boundaries, easements, and land use regulations on government-held territories. His job was to ensure that private interests didn't encroach illegally on protected lands, and vice versa. That knowledge had made him sharp, cautious, and stubborn. He knew his rights. He knew the law. And he knew the HOA had crossed a line. Out beyond his property, the fence that marked the boundary between private ranch land and federally protected land stood silent, untouched for decades. But the sudden arrival of the containers suggested the HOA wanted to change everything, to cut off access, to isolate him, and maybe to force him to give in. John stepped down from the porch and circled the containers, inspecting their placement. They sat on HOA land, or so they claimed, but from his years of audits, he recognized the patch of disputed land where the containers sat, ground tied to federal easements that guaranteed his right to pass freely. His blood boiled. "Not this time," he muttered. The ranch dogs barked in the distance, restless and uneasy. John felt a chill crawl down his spine. This wasn't going to be a simple fight over HOA rules. This was a battle for his home, his livelihood, and maybe something much bigger. The sun climbed higher, but John's resolve hardened. He pulled out his worn notebook and began jotting down notes, plans forming in his mind like the distant storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The shipping containers were just the first move. The real game was only beginning. As dusk settled over the ranch, a restless unease hung in the air. The shipping containers stood like silent sentinels, blocking John's access to the outside world, casting long shadows across his dusty driveway. He hadn't heard a single word from the HOA board all day. Their silence was deafening. It wasn't just the containers. It was the cold, deliberate way they had cut him off without a single explanation. Neighbors who once nodded politely in passing now avoided his gaze. Whispers floated just out of earshot. Questions about John's property, rumors swirling like dust devils in the dry wind. Some said he was hiding something on his land. Others claimed he was difficult and uncooperative. The atmosphere shifted, suspicion creeping like poison through the community. That night, the ranch felt stranger than ever. John sat by the window, eyes darting to every dark corner. He replayed the morning's events over and over, searching for any clue he'd missed. His phone buzzed unexpectedly. A message, this time more chilling than before. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." The sender remained anonymous, but the threat was clear. John's jaw clenched. He wasn't about to back down. Not when he's home, and the truth were at stake. Despite the threats, John's years auditing federal land had trained him to look deeper beneath the surface. That night, Under the weak light of his desk lamp, he spread out maps, satellite images, and legal documents. His finger traced property lines, easements, and federal land boundaries. Something didn't add up. The containers sat squarely on a patch of land tied to federal easements, legal passages that allowed him and the government unrestricted access through certain parts of the community. If the HOA was blocking those, they weren't just violating HOA rules, they were breaking federal law. His phone vibrated again, a call from an unknown number. John hesitated, then answered. "John Harper?" A voice hissed. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Stop your investigations, or this will get ugly." John didn't flinch. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I'm not stopping." The line went dead. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. John's ranch dogs growled low, sensing the tension too. He looked out into the night, where the containers loomed like a fortress of steel and secrets. The blockade wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The HOA was trying to wear him down, isolate him from allies, and break his spirit. But John had a plan. He began documenting everything. The exact time the containers appeared, the dates and locations of suspicious activity around the ranch, every threatening message. He knew evidence was his best weapon. And he wasn't alone. Through whispered conversations and late-night phone calls, John learned that a few neighbors were quietly sympathetic. Some had noticed strange meetings between HOA board members and unknown men in dark suits. Others had seen unusual paperwork being passed around. The community was divided, but the cracks in the HOA's facade were beginning to show. John's mind raced. The shipping containers were only the start, a visible symbol of a hidden war, and he was determined to expose every shadow hiding behind those steel walls. As he closed his notebook, a cold realization settled in. This fight wouldn't just be about property lines or HOA rules. It would be a battle of wills, secrets, and power. And John was ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, John stood at the edge of his property, staring up at the towering shipping containers as if willing them to move. He knew this wasn't just a simple HOA feud, it was a calculated play to trap him. But John wasn't new to battles like this. His years auditing federal land had sharpened his mind for legal warfare, and today he was ready to fight back. Pulling out a worn folder stuffed with property deeds, easement agreements, and government land use reports, John began piecing together his case. The containers weren't just obstructing a driveway. They were blocking federally protected easements, passages legally guaranteed for him and government officials to access certain parts of his ranch and the adjoining federal land. He reviewed the HOA's bylaws, expecting the usual vague restrictions. Instead, he found contradictions, ambiguous language, and even clauses that appeared to violate state laws. The HOA had tried to weaponize paperwork to justify their blockade, but their foundation was crumbling under scrutiny. John reached out to his contacts in the Federal Land Agency, cautiously sharing the details of the blockade and the HOA's illegal actions. He knew federal officials couldn't intervene without solid proof, so he began gathering every piece of evidence he could: timestamps of when the containers were placed, video recordings of HOA board members overseeing the blockade's installation, and statements from neighbors who had witnessed suspicious meetings. But the HOA didn't sit idle. Within days, John's mailbox filled with fines, warnings, and legal notices threatening foreclosure if he didn't remove unauthorized obstructions, namely, his livestock and equipment parked near the containers. The HOA's legal team, armed with aggressive attorneys, launched a barrage of paperwork designed to intimidate and overwhelm. John spent long nights responding with his own well-researched counter-arguments. He cited state property laws, federal easement rights, and local ordinances, dismantling each claim with methodical precision. Every letter he sent was carefully crafted, not just to defend his ranch, but to expose the HOA's overreach. Meanwhile, John noticed something unsettling: a black SUV circling near his property at odd hours. Lights flickered in the distance when he was alone. His dogs growled at shadows. It was clear the HOA wasn't just using legal muscle. They had hired private security, or worse, Despite the mounting pressure, John refused to back down. He met with his few trusted neighbors, sharing his findings and encouraging them to question the board's motives. Slowly, cracks began to appear in the community's united front. One afternoon, John caught sight of the HOA president leaving a private meeting with a well-dressed man none of the neighbors had ever seen before. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces shadowed. John snapped a photo discreetly, proof that this was more than a local HOA dispute. There were bigger players involved. His phone buzzed again, another anonymous threat, colder and more direct. Stop now, or face consequences. John stared at the screen, then looked out across the steel blockade. The shipping containers weren't just obstacles, they were warnings. But John Harper was no ordinary rancher. He was ready for the fight to become a war. The ranch that John Harper once knew was unraveling before his eyes. The quiet community surrounding his property had fractured like a cracked mirror, reflecting suspicion, fear, and growing resentment. Where neighbors once exchanged greetings over fences, now there were cold stares and hushed whispers whenever John passed by. It began subtly. Invitations to weekend barbecues stopped coming. Children once eager to play near John's land now hurried indoors at his approach. Some neighbors, loyal to the HOA board, called John a troublemaker, an outsider stirring unrest. Others kept silent, unsure which side to trust. John felt the isolation keenly, but he refused to let loneliness break him. Deep in his heart, he knew the shipping containers were just the visible symptom of something far darker festering beneath the surface. He needed allies, and fast. One evening, as the sun dipped low, John received a call from Martha Green, an elderly widow who'd lived in the community longer than anyone else. Her voice trembled, but there was urgency in it. "John, I've seen things. Meetings you weren't invited to. Papers signed behind closed doors. This goes deeper than you know." John agreed to meet her at her small farmhouse just beyond the edge of the HOA's jurisdiction. Over cups of bitter coffee, Martha shared what she'd uncovered: irregularities in HOA meeting minutes, unexplained funds withdrawn from the community's accounts, and whispers of secret agreements with developers planning to buy out ranch owners at cut-rate prices. "The board isn't just pushing rules," Martha said, her eyes narrowing. "They want our land, your ranch included." John's mind raced. This explained the containers, the threats, even the strange visitor at the last HOA meeting. The blockade was a tactic to pressure ranchers into selling, to choke their access and wear down their resistance. As they talked, the old woman reached into a drawer and pulled out a bundle of papers, scanned copies of documents she'd secretly kept. "I don't want to see this community destroyed," she said softly, "but we need proof." John took the papers carefully, his resolve hardening. They would need more than just suspicion. They needed facts, evidence, something undeniable. Outside, the wind kicked up, rattling the window panes like the ominous knocking of fate itself. John glanced out toward the containers, their cold surfaces reflecting the fading light. The walls felt less like protection and more like a prison. Back at his ranch, John began a quiet campaign to win back trust. He knocked on doors, shared what he'd learned, and invited neighbors to speak freely. Some were afraid, others hesitant, but a few brave souls began to speak. Stories of overheard conversations, strange deliveries in the dead of night, and neighbors suddenly leaving without explanation. Still, the HOA board remained silent, their fortress of containers unmoving and unyielding. Late one night, John caught movement near the blockade, shadows slipping between the containers. Heart pounding, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The figures melted into the darkness, but John noticed a faint glint of metal. Tools, maybe. Sabotage? The message was clear. The HOA wasn't done. They were playing for keeps. John returned inside, locking every door. The battle lines were drawn, neighbors divided, and the stakes higher than ever. But John wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the soul of the community. The morning air was thick with tension when two unmarked vehicles rolled slowly down John Harper's long dirt driveway. Federal agents, dressed in plain clothes, but moving with quiet authority, stepped out and surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. John watched from the porch, his heart pounding, but his expression calm. After weeks of threats, legal battles, and isolation, John's gamble had paid off. His covert calls to the Federal Land Agency had stirred interest. The containers blocking his ranch sat on land tied to federally protected easements, a serious violation, and the kind of problem the agency couldn't ignore. Agent Marcus Langley approached, extending a hand. "Mr. Harper, we've reviewed your initial reports. We're here to conduct an official investigation into the blockade and possible illegal obstruction of federal land access." John nodded. "I've documented everything. Times, dates, photos, witness statements. The HOA's actions aren't just against me. They're breaking federal law." The agents moved quickly, inspecting the containers, photographing the scene, and interviewing neighbors. Some residents refused to speak, but others, encouraged by the federal presence, cautiously shared what they knew. Rumors about the HOA's secret dealings, strange visitors, and the sudden land grab plans gained more weight. Back inside his house, John watched the agents work, a mixture of relief and weariness stirring in him. The HOA had powerful allies, and the fight was far from over. That afternoon, an HOA representative arrived, looking pale but defiant. They demanded the agents leave, claiming the containers were a matter of private property and community safety. The agents responded with legal citations and federal orders, escalating the standoff. Word spread fast. The blockade, once a local dispute, became front-page news in the county. Journalists and curious onlookers gathered at the edge of the ranch, cameras flashing, questions flying. The HOA's carefully constructed image began to crack under public scrutiny. But with the spotlight came danger. John's phone buzzed late at night with another threat. "Federal agents won't save you. Drop this now or you'll lose everything." The message was chilling, and John knew the stakes had climbed higher than ever before. The following days were a whirlwind of legal maneuvers, press interviews, and whispered warnings. The federal agents urged caution. This was no ordinary HOA fight. They suspected the involvement of a shadowy network of developers and corrupt officials manipulating the situation from behind the scenes. John felt the weight of the battle pressing down on him, but also a strange clarity. This wasn't just about his ranch anymore. It was about holding a corrupt system accountable, about protecting the land and community from greed and abuse. Late one evening, John sat by the window, watching the containers silhouetted against the dark sky. The blockade still stood, but now it was no longer an unchallenged wall. The federal investigation had pierced the silence, lighting a beacon of hope. Yet, deep in his gut, John sensed the HOA's desperation would only grow. They were cornered and dangerous. The question was, how far would they go to silence him? John Harper's nights had become restless, haunted by shadows that seemed to crawl closer with every passing hour. The shipping containers loomed like silent sentinels outside, but now John sensed eyes watching him from within the community and beyond. Despite the federal investigation, the HOA wasn't backing down. If anything, they had become more ruthless. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, John heard the distant roar of engines. He stepped outside just in time to see a convoy of dark trucks speeding away down the road. They left behind a faint scent of burning rubber and tension that prickled his skin. The neighbors whispered rumors about the vehicles: hired muscle, hired spies, hired threats. No one knew for sure who they were, but everyone felt the shift. The quiet community was becoming a battleground. Inside his home, John's phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "This is your last warning. Stop now or lose everything." But instead of fear, the message only steeled his resolve. John wasn't just fighting the HOA. He was fighting a shadowy force that stretched beyond the board, pulling strings in the dark. That night, his ranch dogs barked furiously, their warning piercing the silence. John grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the perimeter. He spotted movement near the containers, a shadowy figure darting between the steel walls. John's heart pounded as he shouted, "Who's there?" But the figure vanished into the night. The next morning, John found his fence cut in 2 places and strange footprints leading toward the containers. Someone had been there, testing the defenses. Fear mingled with anger. This was no longer just a legal dispute. It was intimidation, sabotage, a warning that the HOA's fight was escalating into something darker. Determined to gather proof, John set up cameras around the ranch, hidden among trees and bushes. He also reached out to his federal contacts, asking for increased surveillance and protection. Meanwhile, the federal investigation was picking up pace. Agents uncovered evidence of forged documents, illegal land transfers, and hush money paid to community leaders. The HOA board was under scrutiny. They carefully maintained facade cracking like dry earth. But John knew the real test was yet to come. One afternoon, a strange envelope arrived in his mailbox. Inside was a photo, a picture of his family, taken from a distance, along with a chilling note, "We're watching. Back off, or you'll regret it." John's blood ran cold. The HOA wasn't just attacking his property, they were targeting his life. He stared at the photo, his fingers tightening around the paper. There was no turning back now. The ranch was more than land, it was home. And John Harper would defend it, no matter the cost. John Harper stood at the edge of his ranch, eyes fixed on the shipping containers that had become symbols of an unseen war. The federal agents had promised support, but tonight, the fight was his alone. The community was divided, some fearful, some angry, but no one could deny the tension thickening like a storm cloud. John knew the HOA board was desperate, and desperation made enemies dangerous. Earlier that day, John received an unexpected visitor, Agent Marcus Langley, who brought a tentative offer. "We've got enough evidence to push for a federal injunction against the HOA," Marcus said quietly. "But you have to be ready. This will get ugly." John nodded, feeling the weight of the coming battle settle on his shoulders. As twilight deepened, John prepared. His neighbors who had come forward gathered quietly, some bringing homemade security cameras, others offering to keep watch. They weren't many, but they were determined. Suddenly, headlights flickered at the end of the driveway, a convoy of black SUVs, the same intimidating vehicles John had seen before. The HOA board had sent reinforcements, private security with orders to forcibly remove him. John's pulse quickened. The time for words had passed. The lead SUV stopped just short of the containers. A man in a dark suit stepped out, flanked by guards. He held up a document, a court order that, on its face, appeared legitimate, but was suspiciously rushed through. "This is your final warning," the man said coldly. "Remove your property and leave. The court has ruled." John met his gaze steadily. "I have federal easement rights. This order is flawed, and I won't comply." Tension crackled like electricity. Suddenly, flashing lights appeared behind the convoy. Federal agents, tipped off by John's contacts, arrived in force, blocking the road. A standoff ensued, voices raised, accusations thrown. The HOA security pressed for compliance, but the federal agents held firm. Cameras rolled from the gathering crowd, broadcasting live. John stepped forward, holding the forged court order. "This document is fraudulent. The HOA is trying to strong-arm me with lies." The man's face darkened, but the agents demanded he step back. The crowd cheered softly, emboldened by John's courage. But the HOA's final card was yet to be played. As night fell, an explosion shattered the calm. A fire broke out near the edge of John's property, sending flames licking toward the dry grass. Panic erupted. John and his neighbors rushed to fight the blaze, dousing flames with whatever they could find. The fire roared, threatening to consume everything. In the chaos, John spotted figures fleeing into the darkness, shadows disappearing like ghosts. The HOA had crossed a line. Exhausted and shaken, John knew the fight wasn't just legal anymore. It was survival. The acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air as dawn broke over John Harper's scorched ranch. The fire had been contained, but the damage was a stark reminder. The HOA's tactics had turned violent. Federal agents were now fully involved, combing through the remains and gathering evidence of arson. John stood beside Agent Marcus Langley, watching as investigators uncovered traces of accelerants and surveillance footage showing shadowy figures fleeing the scene. But even as the physical battle raged, John was preparing for the most important fight of all, exposing the corruption hidden beneath the HOA's surface. With Martha Green's documents, the neighbors' testimonies, and the federal investigation's findings, John and the agents had built an airtight case. Yet something still felt off, a missing piece to the puzzle. Late that evening, John's phone buzzed. An anonymous tip, a secure location where the HOA president and the mysterious developer were meeting. With federal agents in tow, John arrived at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, they found stacks of falsified documents, cash-filled envelopes, and recordings of conversations revealing plans to buy out ranches, rig community votes, and bribe local officials. Most shocking was a recording of the HOA president admitting to orchestrating the shipping container blockade and the arson to force John and others into selling. As the agents secured the evidence and prepared to make arrests, John felt a rush of vindication, but also sadness for a community torn apart. Back at his ranch, John stood before the shipping containers, now slated for removal. Neighbors gathered, some apologizing for their earlier silence, others expressing newfound solidarity. John addressed the crowd. This fight wasn't just about me or my ranch. It was about standing up to corruption, protecting our homes, and preserving the spirit of this community. Then came the twist no one expected. During the cleanup, workers uncovered a hidden compartment beneath one of the containers. Inside, John found old maps and federal land surveys, documents revealing that part of the ranch sat on land wrongly claimed by the HOA for decades. This discovery didn't just nullify the HOA's claims, it opened the door for John and his neighbors to reclaim rightful ownership of disputed lands, and sparked an investigation into land mismanagement that extended far beyond the community. The shipping containers, once symbols of oppression, became reminders of a hard-fought victory and the power of perseverance. John looked out across his ranch, feeling the weight of the past months lift. The road ahead would still have challenges, but with truth and community on his side, he was ready. Because sometimes, the greatest battles are fought not just with laws or fences, but with courage, integrity, and the refusal to be silenced.